One of the major highlights of releases in Australian cinema very shortly is a film called Night Raiders. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the Canadian writer-director of Night Raiders, Danis Goulet. Danis, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I first saw your film when I was on the Fapresky Panorama jury last year. And I found it
Wonderful.
I found it such a fascinating film about a dystopian future society where it's the indigenous people who perhaps might offer some salvation. Tell me about the origins of writing this story.
Yeah, I began writing Night Raiders back in 2013, and I think all of my work up until that point had always dealt with the impact of colonization on Indigenous people. So all of the stories that I told. And one of the things that has had a profound impact on our families and communities is the residential school system, which was a child removal policy that was in place by law that the Canadian government put into place for 7 generations of Indigenous families. And it's had a profound impact on Indigenous people up here. And I had felt at the time that it wasn't really talked about. At that time, it hadn't really been talked about in schools or taught anywhere. And so I felt that it really needed to be a bigger conversation. And then through the writing of the film, there was a body set up here in Canada called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they released their findings at some point when I was writing the film. And then I was also thinking a lot about how the changing demographics of North America looking forward into the future means that there's going to be a challenge to power structures in a way in which I kind of was projecting that there's going to be a white backlash in North America, a far right white backlash.
What an interesting origin story, if you like, for the film. So really fascinating. And there are so many facets to your film. I mean, the central facet, of course, is the mother-daughter relationship and the parting, as you say, of the daughter. But so in fashioning the screenplay and setting it in 2043, I think it is, what were the challenges that you faced?
Well, it was, I think, an ambitious undertaking for a first feature. I hadn't really worked with that much VFX, for example. But in some ways, the world building wasn't that difficult because it is only, a few decades into the future. And so everything in the film is sort of based on our existing technologies in a way, like the presence of the drones in the world. And it also just sort of imagines a post-Civil War North America. So imagining that there had been a great war that breaks out and that the maps had been redrawn. But everything that the film pulls from has already happened in history to Indigenous people. So so in this world, children are property of the state and they're taken away from their parents to be sent away to these places known as the academies on the other side of a wall that's been drawn at the border. So all of these things, the restriction of the freedom of movement and the placing people onto land where it's under oppressive circumstances. I mean, all of that already happened in Canada with the setting up of the reservation systems. And then, of course, the child removal policy definitely already happened. And so what the future allowed was just to take all of these things from the past and place them in a near future that allows people to imagine what these circumstances are like, because even though they happened in the past, everything, of course, is very much affecting our present day circumstances. And also, when we ask ourselves, not just as Indigenous people, but as a country of Canada, or this could extend to the questions that any colonized country could ask themselves, who have we been and who do we want to be going into the future? And I think if we do not reckon with what we've done to Indigenous people in order to found our nations as colonized countries, we really will not go forward in a good way. And so to me, this was like a big question of asking for soul searching in a way.
You certainly do that, and you draw the elements together in a very interesting fashion with the focus on the story rather than necessarily on special effects or anything like that. And that's so important. And I really enjoyed your casting. You have such an interesting array of people, including Amanda Plummer.
Yes. Oh, the casting was incredible. We worked with a casting director out of the US, Renee Haynes, and she found everyone. And I think it was even her idea to have Amanda Plummer, which was fantastic. And she was incredible to work with. But, as you mentioned before, the core of the story is the mother and the daughter, played by Elamaya Tailfeathers and Brooklyn Letexier Hart. Elamaya is an incredible actor that I had actually known more as a director until she submitted her audition that totally blew me away. And then Brooklyn was a total discovery. We looked at over 300 girls across North America, but those two just really create the emotional core of the film, which I think, when you're taking all of these ambitious ideas, I mean, really it's about the characters and who you're following on the journey and whether or not you're with them. And so the actors were, all brought something so beautiful and courageous to the roles that they were playing.
Yes, yes. That re-education camp, if you like to put it that way, where all the children had to learn to be part of the state. I mean, that has such resonance. I mean, if you think of China and the way it has treated its people and other countries, so there's a lot of crossover in that idea of state control.
Absolutely. And, I drew on obviously the residential schools, which were meant to assimilate Indigenous children. But I also looked at many different strategies of many different states that do very similar thing. And if you look all over the world, these strategies are very similar, like any of authoritarian states or oppressive states. I mean, I did tons of research on the rise of the Nazis and sort of what were the trends happening at that point that allowed that to happen. And when you look at it on a world scale, and actually we see it happening even in our present day, the rise of different authoritarian leaders. And so it's definitely a time, it feels to me, to be vigilant and also to express this in our storytelling.
Exactly. I was intrigued as to the last part of the film and the way it would conclude. Without giving any spoilers, I suppose you were wrestling with the idea of offering hope or offering a grim sort of reality that might happen. It's an interesting one to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, my take on the ending is that it is hopeful. I think that there is, it's about survival in spite of oppressive circumstances, but also I think the film asks, what does it mean not only to survive, but to thrive? And part of the answer to that question is knowing that you deserve to have a community and to practice your culture, with all of the things that is happening in that Cree camp that Niska, the main character, comes into, but also that you're deserving of love and a community and healthy families, all of these things which, should be things that we take for granted, but those are exactly the things that these systems were meant to fracture. And so I think the ending's hopeful. And I also just, was so inspired by, in activist movements across Canada, the role of youth and, the promise that they hold and the strength and the openness that they have. And to me, Wasis as a character always embodied that hopefulness and, the way that I had been inspired by the young people.
Uh-huh. Very good, very good. I'm always intrigued about the Canadian film industry and how supportive it is of filmmakers. And were you getting much support to be able to make your debut feature?
By the time we went out for funding, we actually got incredible support from Telefilm Canada, who's the main feature film funder here. But that support, I do want to say and contextualize it within a larger collective advocacy effort that was underway for many years, because I've been in the industry up here for a couple of decades now. And I remember being in rooms where we just felt invisible. And when we advocated for, the right for us to tell our own stories as Indigenous people, it was often met with sort of like silence or questions about why we would even want that. And so, many people over many years pushed for us to start to get bigger budgets and to start to get support at the feature level. And a few years prior to the making of Night Raiders, two major things happened. One is that Telefilm created a targeted funding stream for Indigenous feature film production. And the other was that we created the Indigenous Screen Office, which, by the way, we looked at Australia, which had a screen office within Screen Australia since the 90s. So that was part of what we used to say, this is how we can support more Indigenous storytelling. So our Indigenous Screen Office doesn't exist within Telefilm. It's an independent body, but all of that advocacy efforts meant that at the moment where Night Raiders was ready to go, there was just so much support for the film, and it ended up being the largest budget film with an Indigenous person at the helm as a director ever made in Canada. So I think it was emblematic of a moment up here.
That is really interesting to hear. So, and that we had perhaps some influence there as well in Australia.
Oh, for sure. We've looked down at the wave of Indigenous filmmakers down there since the first wave, like in the 2000s. So it's been amazing to have that global connection as Indigenous people.
Okay, excellent news. So tell me, Danis, are there any particular films or filmmakers that perhaps may have influenced your approach or style for Night Raiders?
Yeah, I sort of feel like I were pulling on two different threads in storytelling, one being sort of like activist documentaries, which is really the foundation of Indigenous cinema, as sort of like, Maritamita out of New Zealand was an early, grandmother of Indigenous cinema. Alaniso Bomsawin was another grandmother of Indigenous cinema. But also, I think early in my short film making, I started to sort of get really interested in social realism and filmmakers like Andrea Arnold. And so I feel like I was drawing on the aesthetics of both things. And then the sci-fi element really, like I grew up on sci-fi films, but I feel like a touchstone for me was Alfonso Cuarón's Children of Men, of course, which is one of my favorite sci-fi films of all time, also set in a near future, but also has like a healthy dose of realism within the world. And so I was really drawn to that sense of groundedness in the film, but then you can still go into places that feel fantastical.
Well, what an interesting eclectic collection of influences.
Yeah.
I enjoy those. So, Danis, I'm now quite intrigued. Are you working on another feature?
I am. I actually have just started writing something. And so it's very early, but I'm really excited. And it's set up in sort of northern Saskatchewan, which is where I'm from, in the Midwest of Canada. So I'm starting on the next thing. And I also just had the opportunity to direct an episode of Reservation Dogs, which is a US television show that has shot up and down in Oklahoma. And that was a really exciting project to be a part of as well.
Sounds great. Look, congratulations on Night Raiders. We've been speaking to the writer-director, Danis Goulet, and the film is releasing in Australian cinemas very shortly. Go and see it. Danis, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.